Welcome to the Zions Bank Economic Update. My name is Joseph Mayans, and joining me is senior economist Robert Spendlove to discuss the current economic conditions. Robert, really over the last month, we've seen kind of an intensification of the U.S. China trade war. And along with that, we've seen several new economic data points that came out showing that maybe the economy may be headed towards a recession in the near future. Now, saying that, the Federal Reserve through this time period, they've taken a lot of heat for not lowering interest rates quick enough, according to some people. But through that time, they've also said, look, the labor market is pretty solid. We're seeing, pretty solid job creation, consumer spending, those kind of things. And the U.S. Department of Labor just released their latest employment report that kind of backed up what the Fed had been saying. Well, what do we see in that report?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time. What we're seeing, and really the theme that we're seeing right now, is that we're seeing a lot of mixed data. Right. So during good times, most of the data is pointing up. During bad times, the data is pointing down, but we're really seeing mixed indicators. The Fed has always said we will be data dependent and we'll really be focused on that. But when we look at the jobs report, we see some different signs. So looking at job creation, we had 130,000 jobs created in the last month. That's okay. But the expectation was that we would have about 150,000 jobs created. We had about 150,000 created the month previous. Now, but when you look at the long-term trend, which is what we're showing, in 2017, we had 180,000 jobs created. 2018, 223,000 on average every month, but now we're slowing. We've slowed down to about 158,000 jobs per month, and then in August, we slowed down even further to 130,000 jobs. Now this 130,000 is even a little bit high. It's a little bit misleading. So a big part of this is the U.S. Census Bureau in August started hiring workers for the decennial census, which will come out next year. So 30,000 of this is temporary workers who will be out of a job this year at this time next year. So that really should be closer to about 100,000. In fact, if you look at private payrolls, it only grew by about 96,000. And then even within that 100,000 jobs, it takes about 100,000 jobs growing every month in the U.S. just to keep up with population growth. Right. So really, our zero is not at zero. Our zero is at 100,000. So we're starting to see that slowdown in the labor market that we've been expecting. And even without that, you can see how jumpy the job growth has been throughout much of 2019. When we look at unemployment is looking great. It's one of our really good indicators. Remember, the Fed's dual mandate. The Fed is mandated by Congress to focus on employment and inflation. And so looking at the unemployment rate, 3.7%, nearly as low as the very lowest we've ever seen in December of 1969. If we go a little bit broader, what we're showing is African American unemployment and Hispanic or Latino unemployment are also at historic lows. We've never seen unemployment this low for those populations. And that's a really good sign that some underserved groups are now being pulled into the labor force even more. And so that's a sign of the breadth of the benefit that we're seeing in the economy. And then if we look at our labor force participation rate, so labor force participation rate is essentially saying of our working age population, 16 and older, how many of them are either looking for a job or have a job? And that's our labor force participation rate. If we pull out the group specifically 25 to 54 years old, that's the group that should be working. And so that's the group that it's really important to see them actively engaged in the labor force. We kind of topped out in 2000 at right around 84.5%, dropped down to about 81%. Now we're up to about 82.6. We're nowhere near where we were in 2000. That's where we need to be, but we have been coming up. And so that's a good sign that we're re-engaging people back into the labor force again. Right. And then when we look at some other indicators, wage growth. Mm-hmm. Wage growth is another one of those mixed indicators. Yeah. So when you've got a tight labor market and when you have low unemployment, you should see wages going up quite a bit. In fact, before the recession, we had wage growth around 3.5%, dropped down all the way down to about 1.5% growth. But then as the economy has been recovering, we've seen that going up past the long-term average and actually topped off earlier this year at 3.4%. But now it's come down just a little bit, and we're at 3.2%. This is one of the things that surprised the Fed the most. They thought for sure with that tight labor market that wage growth would continue to accelerate, and it's just kind of stalled for the past year or so.
So I know as economists, a lot of people come to us asking about, is the recession around the corner? You know, you pointed to some of the mixed signals that are in the labor market right now, but really over the past months, some of these recession concerns have really been ramped up. What is it that people are seeing out there? What are we seeing out there that maybe have that concern on people's mind?
Yeah, and we've heard this a lot, this talk of the coming recession, and we need to be really careful about that because we don't want it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't want to say the word recession so much that it happens, but at the same time, there are some indicators that have people making those calls. Number one, we look at what's happening overseas. We talked about China last month, the weakness in China, and that's a direct result of the trade war. Then we also see other countries starting to see their economies starting to suffer or even contract. Germany's GDP is now contracting. The United Kingdom is now contracting. Now this is what's interesting is those are a little different. Germany is contracting because they have a close trading relationship to China. Great Britain is contracting because of the uncertainty over the Brexit vote. Whether there will be a snap election or whether there will be a new referendum. And there's just so much uncertainty that businesses are kind of pulling back and they're a little nervous, and so we're seeing that contraction. But one of the problems that we run into, we call it contagion, where weakness around the world, countries are not isolated and they can have impacts on each other. And so even though we may be directing our attention at China, now we're seeing weakness around Europe and around other parts of the country, and eventually it's going to come back to America as well. Right. So this is one of the strongest indicators that the country may be going into a recession. Historically, for the past 50 years, every time the 2-10 yield curve is inverted, it's resulted in a recession. So this is what had the stock market reacting negatively. Now, again, it could be different this time. And people often say it's different this time. But in my experience, every time people say it's different this time, they find out it's not different. When we look at the manufacturing sector, this is another area that is being directly impacted by the trade war. The manufacturing, now again, we're not sure whether there's a direct relationship, but the manufacturing sector just recently reported that they're now also contracting. Now they've contracted before and it hasn't turned into a recession. They contracted in 2015, they contracted in 2012, but it's another sign of that slowdown, again very closely tied to the movements that we saw with the trade war. And then lastly, this is kind of the probability of the recession, of a recession produced by the New York Fed. And this is very technical, so I'm not going to get into it too much, how they put it together, but it's essentially looking at those probabilities. Now, what's the probability right now? 40%. So that's a low probability, but when we look at past recessions, before the last recession, the probability was about 45%. Before the previous recession, it was around 40 to 50%. So it rarely gets up to about 100%, but we see that probability in their model increasing. So it's something we need to be watching for. It's something we need to be thinking about. The Fed still maintains that there are not clear signs of a recession. I tend to agree with them. There are not clear signs of a recession on the way, but we are seeing signs of a slowdown. And we'll have to keep watching this data, all this mixed data, to really be able to understand what's happening, when it's going to happen, and what the results will be.
Exactly. And to your point on the Fed, just like you talk about, this is becoming much more of a global story, not just a U.S. story, but it's a global story.
Exactly.
So thank you, Robert. Thank you for joining us for this economic update. For more information and analysis, please visit zionsbank.com/economy.